Good morning. It's good to see you all out this morning. Before I begin this morning, I want to take just a second to make you all aware. Jeremy and I are going to be leaving on Tuesday to go out to San Francisco to work with Josh and Calvin, who we help support out there, and the work that they're doing among the Christians there in San Francisco. And we would appreciate your prayers for that trip. We would appreciate prayers that we can be an encouragement to them and can help as they work in their community to spread God's word and to encourage not just Josh and Calvin, but the Christians there that assemble every first day of the week, just like you and I do, to worship God and to praise Him. And we hope that our trip out there can be a help and encouragement to them, and I would appreciate your prayers for that. Ashley and Kim will be joining us on Friday, and each year that they have gone out, Josh and Calvin and Kirby and some of the other women there have expressed just how meaningful that is to them as they help lead some women's studies and teach kids classes there. And so your prayers would be appreciated as we spend the next week working out there with those good brethren. With that said, I'm going to turn your attention to Matthew chapter 22, and we're going to begin there here in just a moment. But before we read this passage of Matthew chapter 22, unless you have been living under a rock, and even then I don't think you could avoid it, we have an election coming up. In just a little over a week, we will have a new president. Here in Indiana, we will have a new governor, along with many other newly elected officials. And regardless of where you stand on any of those political issues, and regardless of who wins the election, roughly half the country is going to be upset about the results of that election. And even though every single politician that will come up and talk to their supporters and try to make their claim as to why you support them, every single politician will say that they desire to bring all of us together. That it is their goal and their ambition under their leadership to unite the people of this country or the people of this state. And even though every single one will claim that, elections seem to just further highlight and deepen the divide among us. Division over politics has run rampant in this country. However, that struggle for political power and that struggle over ideological division or unification is not unique to the United States of America. It is not unique to 2024. It is not unique in any way to our generation. The struggle for power is part of the human existence and experience. And that's where we find Jesus in Matthew chapter 22. Confronted with a question that on the surface is going to call into question loyalty to the power that be during that time period. Let's read Matthew chapter 22, verses 15 through 22, and then I'll have some comments to make about the context around this conversation that takes place. Matthew chapter 22, beginning in verse 15. It says, "Then the Pharisees went and plotted how they might entangle him in his talk. And they sent to him their disciples with the Herodians, saying, 'Teacher, we know that you are true, and teach the way of God in truth, nor do you care about anyone, for you do not regard the person of men. Tell us, therefore, what do you think? Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?' But Jesus perceived their wickedness and said, 'Why do you test me, you hypocrites? "Show me the tax money." So they brought him a denarius. And he said to them, "Whose image and inscription is this?" And they said to him, "Caesar's." And he said to them, "Render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And when they had heard these words, they marveled and left him and went their way. Now, I want to acknowledge a couple of things at the outset. Number one, the political situation that Jesus lived in during his life is different than the one that you and I live in today. At this time period, Rome occupied Israel. Rome was the power in Israel at this time, and they had forcefully taken that power. And as such, you can understand that the Jews had a very contentious relationship with these people who were forcing their rule of law upon the Jews. And their enforcement of that rule of law included the payment of taxes. And so not only were the Jews being forced against their will to give their money to Rome, but they were doing so knowing that that money that they were paying in taxes was not even going to be used to benefit them in any way. And even the structure in which those taxes were being paid and the system that surrounded it was massively corrupt. The tax collectors themselves would keep some of the money that the Jews were paying to enrich themselves, and their taxes could be raised at any point, and the people would have no repercussions in that situation. It was a very unjust, unfair system that the people were living in. And it's with that backdrop that the Pharisees and the Herodians decide to team up to try and entangle Jesus in this conversation. Now, the Pharisees and the Herodians had their own political problems between one another. The Pharisees, a group of Jews that wished to restore the Davidic lineage to the kingship over the Jews. The Herodians, Jews also, but Jews who supported Rome and Herod's kingship over the people of Israel. And so they were most often at opposition with one another, but in this situation, to try and entangle and take down Jesus, they come together. They set their political differences aside for a moment to try to entangle Jesus and ask him a question about taxes and whether or not it was lawful for the Jews to pay those taxes to Caesar. Now, also during this time, it's worth noting that many of the Jews were hoping and expecting that the coming Messiah would lead a revolt against Rome, a military revolt to overthrow Rome. And so you can just imagine how much this answer that Jesus was going to give to this question really meant. How much weight this answer carried. How many problems could arise depending on how Jesus was going to answer this question. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? But what we saw is as Jesus answered that question, his answer was so simple, so direct, so profound, that when they heard it, they marveled and they left. So, what is it about this answer that left people in such amazement? That left people who were so intent upon entangling Jesus and using his answer to try to have him arrested for Roman insurrection of some sort? What is it about this answer that was so profound that these people who had been willing to set aside political differences to try and entangle Jesus all marveled and left when they heard it? It teaches us some powerful lessons about navigating our own politically charged world today. But more importantly, it teaches us some lessons about our relationship with God. And Jesus' instructions were clear. It teaches them and it teaches us today that we have to pay our taxes. Whether the system is corrupt or unjust or not, we have to pay our taxes to the government. And Jesus made that very clear as he answered their question. But that's not necessarily the part of this answer that I want us to focus on this morning. What I want us to focus on instead is the contrast that Jesus establishes between what is Caesar's and what is God's. That's the contrast that Jesus draws. Show me the tax money. All right, whose image is that? Caesar's. And give to Caesar what's Caesar's. But give to God what's God's. He's drawing a contrast here for the people in his presence in that day and for you and I as well. He's drawing a contrast for us between what is Caesar's and what is God's. The coin had Caesar's image stamped on it. Therefore, give it to Caesar. So that then begs the question, if that's the case, if it's Caesar's image on the coin that tells all of them who it belongs to, then what is God's image stamped on? What is the distinction between what Caesar's image is stamped on and what God's image is stamped on? Well, we can go all the way back to the beginning, and you guys are probably well ahead of me on this, because in Genesis chapter 1, that's exactly the phrasing that God chooses to use as he creates man. As God has gone about creating the world around us, creating the sun and the moon and the stars and the animals and the grass and the plants, he comes to his final creation, man. And this is what he says in Genesis 1 verse 26. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So what is God's image stamped on? It's stamped on you and I. It's stamped upon the pinnacle of his creation. And so we can read, for instance, in Psalms 139, verses 13 and 14, as David pens the beautiful words to these songs, he acknowledges exactly what we just saw in Genesis chapter 1. When he says, "For you," speaking to God, "for you formed me in my inward parts. You covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works, and that my soul knows very well." That is David acknowledging exactly what we just saw at the very beginning of all things, that God has formed him. God has made him. God has stamped him with his image. So give to God what is God's. Far too often we find ourselves giving to the world that which bears the image of God. I began this lesson talking about the election that we have coming up. It is very tempting to put our hope in the hands of elected officials. It is very tempting to give our thoughts over to the outcome of an election. Don't give the world that which bears the image of God. God formed you. God made you in his image. Don't give them your heart. Don't give them your hope. Don't give them your peace. Don't give them your faith. You're free to give them your vote. But don't give them what God has stamped with his image. Look in Matthew chapter 6. In Matthew chapter 6, as Jesus teaches from the Sermon on the Mount, he's going to talk a little bit about the treasures that we have and where those treasures should be. And this coincides very similarly with what Tony read for us in 1 Timothy chapter 6 just a few moments ago. But look at what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 6, beginning in verse 19. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. What are you giving to the world, and what are you giving to God? If you are laying up your treasures here on earth, then your heart will be with them as well. And you are giving to the world that which bears the image of God. It is so important for us as Christians, people who are seeking to follow God, to truly give ourselves to him. And in doing so, entrusting him to care for our treasures, entrusting him to care for our hearts and our thoughts. When you think about what happens when we pay taxes, for instance, to our government, we pay our taxes to the government, and at that point, what happens with that money is generally out of our control. Now, we live in a country different, again, from what Jesus lived in, where our votes can determine, to an extent, how some of that tax money is utilized. But for the most part, once that money is turned over to the government, it is out of our control as to what's going to happen with it. We have entrusted it to their care. The same thing must happen when we turn over to God what is stamped with his image. That means when I turn my life over to God, I am yielding my will to his. I am entrusting him to care for and direct how my life is going to be used. When I turn my thoughts over to him and my heart over to him, I am putting my faith in his care for those things. I don't have control over it anymore. It's not mine to direct any longer because I have now turned it over to God. Give to Caesar what's Caesar's, but give to God what is God. And do so with the confidence and with the faith that it is in our best interest to do so. Again, a contrast from how we may view paying taxes to the government. I may not always think that's in my best interest. And I may not always think that they utilize it to my benefit. But that's not the case when I turn my life over to God. That's not the case when I give to God what is rightfully and justly His. He has promised to care for it. He has promised to direct it, and to do so according to His will, and to do so even to my benefit. And so, God, here are my thoughts. Here is my heart. Here are my works. What would you have them do? Where would you have me go? Direct me. Guide me. Use me in your service as I turn myself over to you. It is very tempting during an election season such as the one that we've been exposed to, it seems like forever at this point. It is very tempting to get so caught up in the candidates that are running, so worried or anxious about the outcomes of the election and the future of our country, that we begin to give this world the things that should only be given to God. Let's listen to the words of Jesus. And let's remember that we are stamped with His image and that we are His. And the truth is that this temptation is going to be ever present, even without the pressures of an election. And so it's not as if after next Tuesday, this temptation is going to disappear. It will persist. It will continue. And it truly does take faith on our part to turn our lives over to God and entrust Him with our hope and with our thoughts and with our peace and with our joy, knowing that He will bring about great benefit to us through those things. I want to conclude in Galatians chapter 2. Paul here writes to the Christians in Galatia. And I love what he says in Galatians chapter 2 and verse number 20. And I want you to think about this in the context of what we have been talking about this morning as we begin to draw this to a close and begin to make final application to these words. Galatians chapter 2 and verse 20, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave Himself for me. Those are the words of a man who has given all to God. Those are the words of a man who recognizes, I've been crucified. The man that used to direct my own thoughts and my own actions and my own ways, that man's gone. Now I live in and through Christ. Now He directs my ways. Now He establishes my thoughts. So I want to ask us all this morning, are you willing to give to God all that bears His image? Not keeping some back for yourself. Certainly not keeping some back to give to the world. But are you willing to give all to God that bears his image? The words of Paul in Galatians chapter 2 and verse 20 should be words that you and I can confidently speak as well. Words that reflect an understanding and a willingness to turn all over to God. That's the call and the invitation for us this morning. Have you given your all to God? Have you given all that bears the image of God to him? That's what he longs for from you. And he has promised that he will be a good steward of that which you give to him. The world cannot make that same promise to you. The world does not have your best interest at heart. So don't give to them what is rightfully God's. God is calling on all of us to give our lives to him, to be in harmony with him, because of the sacrifice that Jesus made for each of us, that allows us to have our sins forgiven and to be adopted into his family, a child of his, a joint heir alongside Christ. But it requires our submission, and it requires our humility as we come to obedience to our Father. And he is calling on each of us to do that today. Maybe you've done that. Maybe you have at one point given yourself to God. But maybe as you sit here and you think about how you interact with the world, you realize that you've taken some of that back. And you've begun to entrust your peace to the world. And you've begun to entrust your joy to the circumstances that surround you. God is giving you an opportunity today to come back to him and to give all of those things to him. He'll take them all. And he is trustworthy in fulfilling the promises that he has made to each of us. We're here as a family of God's people to help one another, to encourage one another, to build one another up, to admonish one another when necessary. If we can help you in any way with a spiritual need that you may have, our prayer is that you'll make that known to us. You're welcome to come to the front in just a moment as we stand and sing a song. If you'd like to talk to one of us afterwards or sometime later this week, we would love to do that. But it's our hope that we can all leave here today confidently saying that I have given all that bears the image of God. We can help you do that. Please let us know.